Chapter 10. Darius is staying the night. Even Darius is surprised, but after they were done, he had looked outside and realized that it had started to rain, and he didn't want to make the trip back. So after turning it over in his mind a bit, he asked, and Asher, to his surprise, relented. Now, he's sitting in one of the guest bedrooms in Asher's tree, on a dusty bed cover on top of a bed more comfortable than he's ever slept on in his life. There's a small dresser carved out from the floor on one side of the room, and a nightstand on the other side. There aren't any windows. He just asked a god if he could stay in his house. Or temple? Isn't that what a god's house is? Asher is a god. Darius doesn't exactly know what that means. He just knows it's heavy. Asher had never demanded worship of anyone. He had never commanded anything. He moves like a human, speaks like a human, but he isn't one. Nothing about him is human. The two bright eyes, the golden blood, the rapid healing. He's not human. And he's not just magical either. He's divine. How could a god have shown so much cruelty? Darius lays back on the bed, the tips of his shoes still touching the floor. He takes a deep breath in and stifles a cough. The air is dusty. This bed hasn't been used in a while. He starkly remembers laying like this before, on the floor of his house, Asher looming over him, squatted down, smiling softly. Asher had held a knife out to Darius, handle first. "Take this," he had said, "and do whatever you want to me." And Darius had gripped the handle of that knife like a lifeline. He had shot up, fire coursing through every muscle in his body, and he had plunged the blade into Asher's body, over and over again, into and out of his neck, through both cheeks, through an eye socket, gold spraying out in droplets as he pulled the knife back, the squelching sound of cleaved flesh as he had thrust it back in. And Asher hadn't even moved. Until he had wrestled the knife out of Darius's hands. My turn. Darius twitches. He blinks a few times to get the feeling out. The feeling of stinging, hot pain in his neck, through both cheeks, the way his vision clipped to a smaller field of view as his eyeball caved in under the pressure. Why had Asher done that? That had come after weeks of torture. Weeks. It was a display of Asher's immortality, of his superiority over Darius. They took the same wounds, but only Darius struggled. Was that why Asher had turned cruel? Just some sick sense of superiority? But then, why had he been nice before, when Darius had first arrived? Maybe his divinity means that Darius will never be able to understand him. Darius lets his breath out, gazing at the wooden ceiling sweeping over him. But then again, Darius knows this world. He knows the plants, he knows the animals, he knows the dangers. He may have forgotten some of it, yes, that incident with the Willowbane was embarrassing, but he knows it now. It's peaceful here, and if Asher really molded the world as Darius would cast or shape one of his pieces, then somehow, deep down, Asher could be peaceful as well. In a sense, Darius knows Asher. He knows the art, so he must know the artist. But still, nothing about Asher makes sense to him. Why is he letting Darius get away with things like staying the night when Asher clearly doesn't want him to? Why doesn't he just transform him into a mouse or something? Or eat him? Or just throw him out anyway and leave him to fend for himself in the rain? Or, heck, he's a god. Why didn't he just part the clouds and stop the rain? Darius scooches himself up and onto the bed fully, turning to let his head rest on the pillow. It'd be comfortable if he wasn't so preoccupied with the questions swirling in his mind. Night passes. Sometime during it, Darius sleeps, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels as if he lets his eyes drift closed, and when he opens them again, the lighting has changed, the air is different, and his body feels stiff. He stretches, hearing his body crack. He curls his fingers to get the feeling back in them. Now he has to go out and face Asher again. He didn't think this one all the way through. He forces himself to get up and out of bed, leaning on one of the bedposts for balance. Then He gingerly steps outside of that room and glances up and down the coiled hallway. The air is so fresh. He takes a deep breath. It's calm. He sees why Asher likes it in here. Maybe he should just slip out. Maybe that's why Asher's so keen on having Darius leave. He just wants peace, and he doesn't know if Darius will let him have that. Granted, Darius had made his presence known by bursting into this world after almost being lynched, interrupting what Asher was doing, and proceeding to struggle in almost everything he did until he had thrown a temper tantrum over plants. Maybe Asher's just sick of helping humans. So, maybe Darius should just go. Go where, though? Home? Or somewhere farther away? Darius remembers the way back to the kitchen. He sneaks inside the room, fearful to disturb the morning peace. The sun shines its light from the balcony opening, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor, a slanted shadow across the nearby counter. A cool breeze blows in, and outside, Darius can hear the rustling of thousands upon thousands of sun-soaked leaves, the pitter-patter of raindrops dropping from one to another to the balcony, which just soaks the water up. It's weird to think that Asher's responsible for everything in here, too. He shaped the tree to make it form counters in the tabletop and the archway that leads to the balcony. Not only that, but if he's really the god of the sun, then it was Asher providing the sun's light that grew this tree in the first place. Not to mention stocking it all with so much food, somehow without yielding to his everlasting hunger. Speaking of, Darius is hungry. Asher probably wouldn't mind if he took some more of the stew he made. They left it over the fire. He heads over to it and gingerly lifts the lid off, and immediately almost retches at the scent of the steam wafting up. He had forgotten just how much he had failed at this. Embarrassed, he clamps the lid down, turning away. He'll just leave this for Asher to either throw away or devour in an insane fervor, and he'll go find something else to eat. He's about to push himself off the counter and work on finding an exit when he hears footsteps approaching. For a moment, he considers darting out of the room and pretending like he was never there, but the moment passes and Asher steps inside, clad in the same strange robes as yesterday, rubbing his jawline. "Hey, Darius," he mumbles, heading over to one of the counters and reaching out to open the cupboard above his head. "Are you having some leftovers?" "No," Darius says with a yelp. I'm not hungry. Stomach issues." Over his shoulder, Asher peers at him with one bright eye. "Stomach issues?" "Yeah." Asher chokes back a laugh. "I'll eat the rest of that stuff," he says. "You can have something else." He puts back whatever he had grabbed in that cupboard, ceramic clinking together as he lets go of it. Then he heads over to the pot and takes it off its hooks, setting a hand on the scorching bottom like nothing. Fire. The sun. He carries the pot over to the table and sets it down. "You really don't have to eat that if you don't want to," Darius says, struggling to speak through the growing numb feeling in his mouth. "Since when have I ever turned down food?" Asher asks. "It's like you met me yesterday." "Yeah, it's like Darius met him yesterday." "Grab something for yourself," Asher says. Darius swallows, panic and suspicion crowding his chest, sending chills and goose flesh over his body. "I'm all right," he says. Asher makes a show of rolling his eyes. At that, Darius decides that maybe disobeying the god will lead to a worse fate than taking advantage of his hospitality. As Asher starts to dig into the stew, Darius creeps over to the nearby counter and glances up at the cupboards in front of him. Tentatively, he reaches up to nudge one open, and, glancing back to make sure that Asher's all right with this, inspects the contents. The first thing that jumps out at him is a colorful, shiny box. He takes it out, feeling the strange, smooth texture, and looking at the bright image on the front, an overemphasized caricature of some kind of raccoonish creature holding a spoon and a spilling bowl of red, sphere-like things. At the top, bubblish letters spell out "Coatoms" in colorful text. Darius hears Asher laugh. "You look so confused right now," the god says through a mouthful of food. "Well, I am confused," Darius says. "What on earth is this? I guess, what off earth is this?" Asher chuckles. "Breakfast cereal?" Darius furrows his brow. This doesn't look like cereal. What year are you from again? Asher asks. 1859. Right. Asher draws out the word. Breakfast cereal. Initially a wonderful and tooth-shattering way for Americans to get their fiber needs met. But in the future, you're lucky if you can glimpse a crumb of grain between all the sugars and dyes. I like to rot my teeth sometimes. What can I say? Darius smiles. You know that sugar being bad for your teeth is a myth, right? Asher laughs incredulously. If you say so, why don't you go ahead and try that? This is what Darius is doing, he thinks to himself. He just found out that the only other sapient being on this whole world is a god, and he's not probing the depths of that, but instead learning about some weird food that doesn't even look like food. He opens the box, finding it to be flimsier than he first thought, and reaches a hand in. He scoops out a few dry, dusty red balls, each no bigger than a marble. Looking over his shoulder at Asher one more time, he pops them into his mouth. They instantly dry out his mouth and coat it with a too sweet taste. This isn't the sweetness of a fresh-baked pastry or a juicy apple. It's a sweetness so offensive it plays on the edges of sour and acrid. He coughs into his hand, leaning on the counter. Behind him, he hears Asher laughing. This is terrible, Darius groans. How do you like this enough to keep it in your house? I just do, Asher says through laughter. Our tastes aren't always going to match up. Ugh. Darius puts the box back in the cupboard and closes it, trying not to slam it, but it still makes a pretty big noise. He turns around, leans back against the counter, and folds his arms. I'll just have something when I get back home, he says. I like the things that grow here way better than that anyway. Better than most of what I had on Earth, too. Meeting Asher's gaze, he finds a certain intrigue in the god's eyes, but he doesn't have the nerve to keep looking for long. He lets his gaze drift toward the sunlight streaming through the balcony, and he hears Asher finishing up the stew and gulping down the broth. Darius figures that he should probably just excuse himself, but he knows that the myriad of unanswered questions darting around in his mind will drive him crazy. So, he says, trying to break the silence, you're a god. Yes, Asher says, plain and simple. Mm-hmm. Asher gets up and heads to the sink to wash the pot out. Simple as can be said. Darius watches the water running. God of flesh and sun, he muses. The two share a bit of silence. Darius doesn't even know where to begin. All he knows of gods is the one he had known about from Earth, the god of everything, the only god said to exist. He supposes he might as well try to tell what exactly Asher means with the word. What does it mean to be a god? He asks. What makes you different from anyone else who can cast spells? Asher sighs, and Darius inches back, afraid he may have offended him. But when Asher speaks, his tone remains calm and matter-of-fact. Couple things, he says, setting the pot in the sink. We're effortlessly immortal. It'd take a miracle to kill me. Soul's tethered to the body real tight. We also have our domains. A mortal being could never understand the kind of connections we have with what we're gods of. And unlike mortal cult leaders who just get gratification from worship, we actually put it to good use. He straightens up a bit, seemingly proud. The answer blooms new questions for Darius, and for a moment, he actually looks forward to asking them. Worship? He asks eagerly. As in, prayers? Psalms? Asher hesitates. Those are kinds of worship, he says slowly, and he doesn't elaborate, even as Darius waits. Darius hesitates to probe any further. Asher slouched back down again, and the way he leers at Darius from the corner of his eye tells him that the subject's not worth broaching right now. I see, Darius says. He sighs, trying to figure out a way to wiggle back into the conversation without offending Asher. But with loose memories of blood and twisted bodies crowding his mind, he figures there's no safe way to continue. Do you want me to leave you alone? Darius asks. Asher takes a few moments to respond, but he finally lets loose a shuddering sigh and speaks. Yes, he says. Darius turns to leave. Don't forget your pot. Darius turns around and heads back to the sink. He stands right next to Asher to reach in and get his pot, which is already dried somewhat. He realizes that Asher's radiating a sort of warmth. "Thank you," Darius says. "Mm-hmm," Asher says. Darius turns to leave again, but Asher stops him with a small hand on his arm. Darius tenses, expecting some sort of pain. "Darius," Asher says softly, "I really liked that you made something for me to eat. Feel free to do that anytime. I don't mind if you come over. It actually, makes things easier for me. Gives me a bit of peace of mind." Darius swallows nervously. "As long as you don't mind the quality of the food," he says, trying to crack a joke. Asher smiles wryly, then turns away, resting his hands on the counter. End of chapter 10.